There may be some optimism from Professor Boltanski. He is going to talk to us towards a European neo-conservatism, question mark. At least there's a question mark. From the formation of an economy or authenticity to the renewal of nationalist ideologies. Welcome, Professor Boltanski.
Thank you very much, Professor Bewavoy, for having invited me. Well, several European societies, and particularly France, on which my fieldwork is centered with a group of colleagues, are presently plunged into a paradoxical and worrying conjuncture that recalls, by some of its aspects, what happened during the year leading to the Second World War in Europe. Such a conjuncture can be characterized first by an important increase of inequalities that are progressively reaching the level they had at the beginning of the 20th century, as Thomas Piketty shows, after their decrease during the post-Second World War years. These inequalities are triggered by the impoverishment of the poorest confronted with unemployment and precarious job, and enhanced by neoliberal measures implemented by the members of the ruling elite, including those who claim to belong to the left. But the rise of inequalities is above all triggered by the enrichment of a dominant class that is not so much linked with an increase of wage inequalities as with an increase of inequalities ensuing from the distribution of frequently inherited patrimony and from incomes of annuities it generates. Secondly, the present conjuncture can be characterized by a decay of the social protest movement anchored in the left, or in the extreme left, and at the opposite, by a considerable development of the extreme right, at the same time electorally and on an ideological plan. By some aspect, this extreme right presents features that recall American neo-conservatism, such as nationalism, moralism, and the rejection of what its instigators call political and cultural liberalism. But at odds with the American conservative movement, this extreme right in France and in other countries of Europe pretends also struggle against economic neoliberalism in order to defend the genuine people of the nation, threatened by the consequences of neoliberal policies. It proposes to impel that defense by promoting authoritarian and xenophobic measures aiming at rearming of a national identity presented as aggressed by external and internal enemies, such as emerging countries, European institutions, and above all, by immigrants and minorities, particularly in France, Muslims and Gypsies. From such a situation stems a general drift towards the right, or the extreme right, that concerns not only the political space, but also civil society as a whole. In order to understand this state of affairs, we must take into account social changes brought about by the transformation of capitalism during the last decade. one can see in these transformations a reaction of capitalist firms and organizations to a crisis of accumulation and profits whose development hampered European capitalism since the 70s. The changes I have in mind are twofold. A first change is a disindustrialization process that has resulted for a large part from the externalization towards low-wage countries of the production of common goods. It can be seen as an outcome of the re-engineering of the big firms implemented since the 90s that have transformed productive organization as well as modes of authority and control of the workforce, and have finally modified the way capitalist arrangement can be justified and legitimized. It is what we call the new spirit of capitalism. This new mode of management has been explained by the necessity of acquiring productivity gains, but one of the results, and maybe of their hidden objectives, has been to tame a working class that during the 60s and 70s has proved to be particularly activist, especially in France and Italy. A consequence has been to lead to an important decrease in the number of industrial workers and more generally to impoverish, disorganize and nearly blow up the working class whose unions have been eroded without being taken over by other kinds of organizations capable of representing and mobilizing the working force. A second change, which no, qu'est-ce que ça? Sorry, because I had space. No. Yes, because I thought they were suppressed this slide, but they were still there. A second change, which developed simultaneously and which is more and more prevalent, is the spreading of capitalism towards domains that were seen before as economically marginal, such as luxury craftsmanship, art, ancient or contemporary, design, antiques or vintage brands, fashion, ancient real estate with character, and even natural environment or classified sites. At this enumeration, one can add tourism and activities that has considerably expanded in contemporary Europe, and particularly in France, a country which is, with nearly 80 million of arrival a year, the first tourist destination in the world. These domains form a heterogeneous sphere, including very different subfields intermingling the public and the private sectors. The people who participate in it can have very different occupations, such as the designing of crocodile luxury bags, the fixing of art shows or festivals, the branding of antique mansions, or as well gastronomy and the management of elite restaurants. One must add that these different actors draw from their activities resources that can take different legal forms, from annuities to wage, and more frequently to precarious and uncertain modes of remuneration. This diversity of activities and above all of economic status excluded the hypothesis of a unified so-called creative class recently presented by well-known social theorists. Our own hypothesis is that we are effectively confronted with a specific sphere of capitalistic accumulation whose extension is unprecedented. As an example, one can take the case of luxury brands, a sector whose growth is now around 9% a year, with margins which are difficult to pinpoint, but that are certainly much higher than it is the case in classical industrial sectors. If our hypothesis is correct, capitalist forms of extracting profit would have been partly displaced from an industrial economy towards what can be called an economy of patrimonialization. I will add that these displacements have jointly a local and global character. They are global in the sense that they benefit from the externalization of the production of current goods towards low-wage countries, even if these bonds are still partly conceived in Western Europe. They are also global in the sense that this type of economy generates benefits from the formation of a global dominant class whose richness largely relies upon finance and upon what is euphemistically called fiscal optimization. But these changes are also local in the sense that they rely upon the valuation of resources whose externalization is difficult because they are rooted in the web and history of European countries. That valuation process is based upon the branding of nations, towns, and regions. It relies more generally on the systematic exploitation of the past, things at the core of that commodification process are very frequently associated with marks of national identity that are supposed to guarantee their authenticity. The fact of being locally rooted is then, in this case, a very important factor of richness creation. Forms that support that patrimonialized economy trigger specific kinds of inequalities in relation with the social and economical structure in which richness is generated. First, the agents who contribute to the making of richness are not concentrated but scattered, not only spatially, but also according to a great number of other features, particularly in the legal realm. Secondly, property relationships are much more impenetrable than in an industrial economy based on the opposition between the owners of the means of production and the salaried workers who have nothing to sell but their workforce. At the level of the forms and convention on which the making of value relies, important difference must also be noted. An industrial economy depends mainly upon a form which can be called the standard form, the invention of which played a central role in the development of capitalism since the 19th century and the making of a consumption society. Conversely, economies that take advantage of patrimonialization are based on another conventional form that we called the collection form. Without going into detail, I will specify some characteristics of this form that present features at odds with the standard form, which was at the core of an industrial economy. First, it concerns goods that are not supposed to fulfill some needs, and even that are not to be, properly speaking, used in the course of daily life, but which are accumulated. Secondly, that form is oriented towards the past. In such a frame, costs are not mainly production costs, but costs which incur so as to preserve, restore, or insure the valued things. Besides, the collection form makes possible the valuation of things that, seen from the point of view of the standard form, can be seen as rubbish. Finally, at the opposite of the standard object, whose value decreases with time, the value of the objects seen from the collection form perspective tends to increase under the action of time. In that type of economy, things that have been considered for a long time as devoid of any value are submitted to a process of enrichment that increase their price. Such a process can have a material aspect, for example, when a mansion is restored, but it has also, or even above all, a symbolic dimension. The enrichment process of a thing depends on a narrative that is attached to it and which guarantees its authenticity. This narrative tells a story up to provide that object with a singular identity and to confer it a memorial force a memorial force by connecting it to persons and events situated in a more or less faraway past, but who remain vivid in collective remembrance. Now, it is largely according to this presumed authentic character that the price of the thing is fixed in the course of market exchange, with considerable price gap between the thing said authentic and a copy even perfectly similar to the original. I will finally insist on another characteristic of these enriched objects. They cannot only be exchanged on specialized markets, but also be capitalized nearly in the same way as financial assets. Their aesthetic or historic value is grounded upon the judgment of experts connected with legitimate cultural institutions, and their commodification is frequently operated by worldwide sale firms. For these different reasons, such objects acquire a very stable value and a high level of liquidity that make it possible to deal with them as quasi-reserve currency. Consequently, they are more and more frequently used so as to fix and save profits drawn from more unstable financial markets. As any economic activity in a world under the reign of capitalism, this patrimonialized economy generates a class structure and provokes specific inequalities. At the higher and middle range of this hierarchy are persons, families, and funds possessing patrimonialized goods and estates considered mainly as a capital apt to generate profit. We can now witness the expanding formation of a patrimonial class whose incomes are drawn from the commodification of private goods, whose enrichment process has been partly implemented with the help of public money. Among the upper levels of this hierarchy are also different groups composed of experts, institutional managers, or scholars who hold the power to promote the enrichment of outstanding objects or selected places, whose memorial force largely relies on their judgment and on the narrative they compose. But in order to function, this kind of economy requires also a great number of persons who participate in the valuation chain by doing fragmented material or intellectual tasks, such as establishing catalogs, restoring objects, managing shows and festivals, and so on. These actors are frequently young, highly educated, but submitted to precarious conditions of employment. Being strongly involved in their activities, longing for social promotion, and being easily replaceable because of their number, they constitute a task force widely exploitable. Below them are numerous workers, frequently women, or illegal immigrants, taking on quasi-domestic tasks of cleaning and servicing, who belong to the most precarious and exploited stratum of the popular class. One can think that it is possible to connect, at least for a part, the present political drift towards the right I presented at the beginning of this talk with the economic changes I have rapidly summarized. In France, the relationship between the process of disindustrialization and the empowerment of the extreme right has been frequently noted by political scientists who have laid stress on the displacement of nearly half of the working class voters towards a political party, the National Front, whose propaganda is centered on xenophobia, nationalism, and particularly economical nationalism or national preference. But the problems of the working class are not the only factor in the growth of the extreme right. The extreme right finds also a strong support among members of what I call the patrimonial class. The members of this class have economically grounded interests that make them particularly sensitive to a propaganda insisting on insecurity for which the poor, above all if they are of foreign origin, are supposed to be responsible, and on a national identity that is supposed to be jeopardized by the presence of aliens and immigrants. Thank you very much. It is less optimistic that you spoke,
yes,
that you talked yesterday.
Yes, no, but actually what you do, Professor Boltanski, is make Piketty into a sociologist. You're filling him with a bit of sense, sociological sense. Very good. Yes, patrimonial capitalism.